In this video, we present our work, Regulating Algorithmic Filtering on Social Media. This is a work by Cen and Shah and was presented as a spotlight at NeurIPS 2021. Before we delve into the details, let's start with what this talk is about. In this talk, we focus on how social media platforms filter the content that appears on the feed that is shown to a user. In recent years, there have been rising calls to regulate filtering algorithms, but translating a regulatory guideline into an auditing procedure has proven difficult. For one, an audit must translate something human-readable into something that can interface directly with an algorithm. Not only that, but it needs to do what regulators intended and do so reliably without causing unintended side effects itself. This problem is precisely what our work addresses. So in our work, we ask two questions. First, how should one translate a regulatory guideline into an auditing procedure? And as our main contribution, we provide an auditing procedure such that given a regulation, an auditor can check whether a platform's filtering algorithm is in compliance. We then show that this procedure is carefully designed to have strong statistical guarantees on how well it enforces the regulation that it's given. The second question we ask is, how does the audit affect stakeholders, namely the platform and its users? We find that the performance cost that the audit places on the platform can be low. In other words, that there is not necessarily a strong performance regulation trade-off. We find that content diversity plays a key role here. Under regulation, the platform is naturally incentivized to ensure the content is sufficiently diverse. Because diversity is not in the audit by design, this result suggests that content diversity may help to align the interests of regulators and platforms. So why do we care about algorithmic filtering? Well, people are increasingly turning to social media platforms as their information sources. For instance, platforms show us videos of recipes, provide us with the latest news, and recommend us products. The process that platforms use to curate content is known as algorithmic filtering. Specifically, given a user and a collection of available content, platforms construct a filtered feed, big Z, which is a collection of M pieces of content, each described by feature vectors, little z. In recent years, there have been increasing calls to regulate how social media platforms filter their content. For example, one might ask that the advertisements a user sees not be based explicitly or implicitly on their sexual orientation, or that the content related to public health issues such as COVID-19 that is shown to a user do not reflect that user's political affiliation. Or you may ask that platforms do not sway users' voting preferences beyond the role that they already serve in connecting people as a social network. But translating any of these human-readable regulatory guidelines into auditing procedures is difficult. There are a few issues that always arise that we try to address in this work. First, because we don't have a general procedure, the auditing of social media is currently very reactive. Audits need to be designed as issues arise, which means that these audits are narrowly applicable and that there is a delay between design and enforcement. All this to say that there is a need for general auditing procedures. Something else we need to keep in mind is whether an audit places a performance cost on the algorithm. Both users and platforms are generally not very happy with high-cost audits because they lower profits for the platform and result in worse personalization for the users. We also have to be careful about censorship. Some audits require blacklisting sources or removing content, which brings issues of free speech into play. There's also the issue of privacy. Some audits themselves require detailed personal user data, which can be a problem. So an audit that can operate without access to this detailed data is desirable. Lastly, an ongoing issue for auditors are trade secrets, which in this context protects platforms from having to reveal too much detail about their algorithms to auditors. Getting access to these algorithms is sometimes possible, but it's a fight that auditors will always come up against, so there's a benefit to audits that don't need deep access to the algorithms. And there are many more challenges to designing audits. So, we're faced with the question, is there a principled way to translate a regulatory guideline into an auditing procedure? As our main contribution, we provide a procedure such that, given a regulation that can be expressed in counterfactual form, which we define shortly, an auditor can test whether that regulation is met by the platform. Operationally, the procedure has several desirable properties. It needs only black box access to the filtering algorithm. It does not require access to the users or their personal data. It is modular and can be scaled up as desired. The procedure's parameter is intuitive to tune. And finally, it does not require content removal. We then studied the auditing procedure from 3 stakeholder perspectives: the auditors, the platforms, and the users' perspectives. From the auditor's perspective, we proved that there is a statistical guarantee on how well the audit enforces the given regulation. From the platform's perspective, we show that there are conditions under which the trade-off between regulation and performance is low. Lastly, we examine how the audit changes the content that the social media platform is incentivized to show its users. We find that under regulation, platforms are incentivized to ensure the content has enough diversity. Before we get to the procedure and results, let's look at the setup. The platform selects the content shown to its users by taking an inputs X, applying a filtering algorithm F, and producing the feed Z equals f of x. Here the inputs X capture any factors the platform uses to filter, such as the current pool of content, the available advertisers, the user's attributes including their interaction history, and so on. Each feed Z is a collection of M pieces of content corresponding to information, photos, videos, and more. We assume that F can be written as a generative model in which F generates Z by drawing M samples from a distribution PZ theta, where the parameters theta belong to a model family capital theta. In this setting, the auditor's task is as follows. Given a regulation and black box access to the platform's filtering algorithm F, check if F is compliant with the regulation. Here, black box access means that platforms can run, or auditor can run F on a set of inputs xj and observe the output cj, but does not need further access to F. In summary, the auditor's task is to determine whether the filtering algorithm F is compliant with the regulation that the auditor is given. In this work, we restrict our attention to regulations that can be expressed in what we call counterfactual form. Specifically, regulations that can be written as: algorithm F must behave similarly under x and x prime for all pairs x, x prime in some set S. Note that x and x prime need not correspond to actual inputs or actual users, but they could correspond to hypothetical users or hypothetical scenarios. So in this way, the auditor would like to see how F behaves in the potentially hypothetical scenario X and determine whether it is similar to how F behaves in scenario X prime. And the auditor may wish to do this over many such x, x prime pairs in S. So you may ask at this point, well, what types of regulations can be expressed in counterfactual form? We provide 2 simple examples. We can write the requirement that articles containing medical advice on COVID-19 be robust to users' political affiliation, as equivalent to the articles shown by F that contain medical advice on COVID-19 should be similar whether a user is left-leaning or right-leaning. We can also write the statement that it is not the platform's job to sway voting preferences beyond serving as a social network, as equivalent to posts about political candidates that are injected by F should be similar to the content a user would see from a social network without any algorithmic filtering. So here the key word is that algorithm F must behave similarly under x and x prime for x, x prime in S. The question remains, what is an appropriate notion of similarity? To answer this question, we begin by observing that algorithmic filtering is powerful and often harmful because information influences decisions. For example, the content that F filters affects how the user votes, whether they get vaccinated, where they eat, what items they purchase, and more. Stated differently, if filtering did not influence users' decisions, then there would be no desire to regulate it. The implication is that if one enforces or seeks to enforce similarity between the feed produced by F given X and that produced by F given X prime, the notion of similarity that is enforced should be with respect to the outcome of interest, the user's decisions. We now show that enforcing a counterfactual regulation with respect to users' decisions is a matter of enforcing what we call decision robustness. To define decision robustness, suppose that there are 2 identical hypothetical users. In other words, take a user and imagine them in 2 worlds. In one world, this user is shown f of x as a feed, and in another world, they are shown f of x prime instead. So we have 2 parallel worlds where the only change is the feed a social media platform filters for its user. In both worlds, the only change is the feed, and after being shown the feed, both users face an identical set of decisions or queries queue. For example, who to vote for, where to eat dinner, what to buy for a gift, what to watch on TV, and so on. Let D denote the hypothetical decisions that the user would make in answer to these queries in one world, and D' denote the decisions that the user would make in the other world. We define decision robustness as follows. F is decision robust to X and X prime if and only if, for any Q and any user, one cannot determine with high confidence that X does not equal X prime from decisions D and D prime. With this definition, the auditor's objective to determine whether F complies with a counterfactual regulation comes down to testing whether F is decision robust. And we show in our work that this can be formalized as a hypothesis test. There is one key point to note before moving on. Although decision robustness provides a guarantee with respect to decisions D and D prime, an auditor does not and often should not have access to the users or their decisions. As one of our main technical contributions, we show that the auditor can guarantee decision robustness without access to either. Let's look at the auditing procedure. Recall that regulations we are interested in can be written as algorithm F must behave similarly under X and X prime for all pairs in S. Let's consider a specific X prime pair. The auditing procedure then takes in 5 inputs: F, X, X prime, capital theta, and its 5th input is a tunable parameter epsilon that controls the strictness of regulation. The first 2 steps of the procedure are to compute the minimum variance unbiased estimates of F given X prime and F given X. Here, L plus denotes the minimum variance unbiased estimator, or MVUE, and when the MVUE does not exist, you can use the maximum likelihood estimator, or MLE, instead. The third step of the procedure is to compare a statistic given on the left of line 3 to a threshold given on the right of line 3. If it exceeds the threshold, then F does not pass the test, otherwise it does. These 6 lines are at the core of the auditing procedure, and you can repeat these steps for as many X prime pairs as needed. This procedure has several advantages. It requires only black box access to F. It does not require access to users or their personal data. It is modular in that it can be scaled up for as many X prime pairs as needed. For those interested in individual or intersectional fairness, this modularity is important. Its main parameter epsilon is intuitive to tune, and we show later that it corresponds to a false positive rate. And lastly, there is no content removal. We'd also like to note that this procedure can of course be combined with other auditing methods. So what exactly does this auditing procedure do? Our main result is to show that there's a strong guarantee on how well the audit enforces the regulation. Informally, the main theorem states that if the filtering algorithm F passes the audit, then F is guaranteed to be approximately asymptotically decision robust. An alternative way of expressing this result is that if F does not pass the audit, then the auditor is 1 minus epsilon confident that F is not decision robust as M goes to infinity. The takeaway here is that the audit enforces strong similarity between how F behaves given X and given X prime as prescribed by the regulation. This result also demonstrates that epsilon corresponds to the false positive rate, and increasing epsilon increases the strictness of regulation. Recall that the audit uses the minimum variance unbiased estimator, or MVUE. Our second main result provides insights on why the MVUE is useful, even in the non-asymptotic case. Informally, the proposition states that when faced with a decision between a finite number of options, the decision of the hypothetical user whose belief after viewing some content Z is given by the MVUE is more sensitive to their content Z than any other user would be. The main takeaway here is that when an auditor does not have access to users or their decisions, they can use the MVUE instead. The proposition states that one can think of the MVUE as providing an upper bound on how much a feed Z can influence a user's decisions. In other words, the user whose decisions are most sensitive to the content that they see is this hypothetical user corresponding to the MVUE. This result is useful because it allows the auditor to reason about users' decisions without access to the users or their decisions, which can be expensive or unethical to obtain. And so we've seen that this audit has some desirable guarantees, and these guarantees are quite strong. One may then ask if the audit is too restrictive, specifically if there is a trade-off between regulation and performance. We find that there are conditions under which there is no such trade-off. Informally, the result states that when the platform's performance is independent of elements and data, and those elements have sufficient leverage over the fisher information, then as long as the feed is finite and the available content is expressive enough, there is no regulation performance trade-off. Here, performance could be a measure of the predicted user engagement, content novelty, revenue from advertisements, a combination of these factors, or more. The takeaway is that there are conditions under which the platform can pass the audit without sacrificing performance. But there's another way to interpret this result. As we explain in our work, the fisher information is related to content diversity. Under this interpretation, as long as there's enough flexibility in the available content, then the trade-off is less severe when the content diversity is sufficiently high. For some intuition, recall that the audit means that the outcomes under Z and Z prime are sufficiently similar. As one may expect, when the content diversity of Z and Z prime is low, for example, if one feed contains lots of content saying that it will rain in New York, while the other contains lots of content saying that it won't rain, an auditor can easily distinguish between the downstream effects of Z and Z prime. So as a review, our work tackles the question, can we translate a regulatory guideline into an auditing procedure? As our main contribution, we provide such an auditing procedure, such that given a regulation that can be expressed in counterfactual form, an auditor can test whether that regulation is met by the platform. The audit has several desirable properties, including that it needs only black box access to the filtering algorithm, it does not require access to the users or their personal data, it is modular, its parameter is intuitive to tune, and finally that it does not require content removal. We studied the audit from 3 stakeholder perspectives. From the auditor's perspective, we confirm that there is a statistical guarantee on how well the audit enforces the given regulation. From the platform's perspective, we show that there are conditions under which the trade-off between regulation and performance is low. And lastly, we examined how the audit changes the content that the social media platform is incentivized to show its users, and found that under regulation, platforms are incentivized to ensure the content is sufficiently diverse. Thank you for listening, and feel free to reach out with any questions.